Hi, Tim.
Hey Bob, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. How's your New Year going?
Good so far. I'm got a little co-working office with some other Substackers here, so it's fun to
Oh,
have
cool.
kind of have some coworkers.
Oh, cool. Is that like a WeWorks or what?
Yeah, it's a former WeWorks. The
Mm.
WeWork, WeWork imploded, so this one I guess they got out of their lease, but the landlord turned it into like independent WeWork. So yeah,
Cool. So
it's fun.
you're doing a lot of Substack bonding. There's a.
Yeah, it's Matt Iglesias that sort of organized it. So I get to talk to
Oh,
him
you're there in
and
DC. Is Matt is
yeah,
there?
yep, yep,
Wow. Tell him I said hello.
I will do that.
So let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You're Tim Lee, publisher of the Understanding AI newsletter. And in a way, this is the Understanding AI podcast as well, because we've been having these monthly conversations. It's something we're kind of experimenting with to see if that makes sense as a rhythm for a podcast about AI. I think that there may be value in looking back at the last month and making sure the big stuff gets covered in a kind of one-stop shopping way. In any event, the podcast is posted on your newsletter, your Substack site, as
Yep.
well as on mine and being in my feed and so on. So, um, one interesting dynamic that's emerging between us, I think, is that I'm more worried about AI than you are.
Hmm.
And this, of course, may just be a dispositional thing, but that doesn't mean that one of us won't turn out to be right. So
Yeah.
it's worth talking about. I'm a little bit of a worrier, and do you kind of come out of a libertarian background, a little
Yeah.
more hands off? So not worrying is part of your ideological identity, right?
Yeah. I mean,
If you worry
I
about
would not
regulation,
say,
I mean, you worry about regulation, but aside from that,
yeah,
no worries.
yeah. I mean, I'm less libertarian than I, was when I was younger. But yeah, definitely, no regulation is often my default view, and I also think temperamentally, I don't know, I just have a pretty chill, like, temperament. So,
Yeah.
and like I think that generally speaking, like on a kind of Steven Pinker bandwagon of like life has been getting better over the decades and centuries, and so
Hmm.
most of the time, like technology works out better for people. So I'm not like dogmatic about it. It certainly is possible. I mean, there have been technologies that have made things worse, but yeah, my default assumption is probably things will work out okay.
So maybe we can actually start out pursuing this theme of kind of how fast things are moving. What clues have emerged over the last month as to how fast things are moving and whether or not we should be worried. There are other topics we're going to get around to, including certainly the New York Times copyright lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft, which you've written about in your newsletter, and some other stuff. An update on kind of Altman, OpenAI. There's more to say about that. And actually, that feeds into this discussion about how fast things are moving, because I would say the first reason to think they're moving fast is that uh, the accelerationists seem to have won that battle at OpenAI. And I want to talk later about the kind of paradox of Sam Altman being a kind of de facto accelerationist in terms of how he's running OpenAI, even though he, I think, genuinely professes to be very worried about AI risk. I want to get into that down the road, but there's that reason to think that things are going to keep moving fairly fast. I won't get into the various parts of OpenAI's business model that I think you know keep things moving rapidly. The APIs and the release of these do-it-yourself bots and so on. Um, the uh, the I guess in terms of things that have come to my attention over the last month, I would also say it's really clear that open source is happening in a big way. We knew there was open source AI already. We knew Meta was going all in on open source. So that's going to be the place you're most likely to see big so-called frontier models that are open source. There's also, I guess, this company Mistral. That's in France or somewhere in the Middle East or both or something
Hmm.
which has pretty impressive open source models. But what you're hearing more and more is people going, whoa, so I can put the equivalent of ChatGPT 3.5 from Meta, the Llama 2, on my computer. Doesn't even need an internet connection. The whole thing is on my computer. And, I can even get something slightly less powerful on my phone. So you're seeing this, and a lot is happening on that front, I would say. There's also another thing that you actually brought to my attention was via this podcast, Cognitive Revolution podcast with Nathan. Is his last name Lebenz, or
Yeah,
is that right? Which I've been listening to for some time, but I had missed this one podcast about this thing Mamba, which I would argue is about as threatening as it sounds. No, I'm kidding, but it is. It could be a big source of acceleration. Nathan is certainly, pretty worked up about it. Not necessarily in a negative way, but he thinks it's big. And what it is a strong hint that transformers, which are the foundation of current large language models, these things that became a big deal around 2017 via this big paper about attention and so on, they're not the last word. And we may have, in some ways, a fundamentally different approach over the horizon that could be much, much more powerful than these transformers. That's the upshot of the Mamba thing. We can maybe get into that a little later, because I'd like to get your take on what you think is new about it. But the point is, he's a very credible voice, I think, Nathan Lebenz.
Yeah.
He thinks it's a super big deal. I don't have the technical competence to assess the argument, but I certainly wouldn't dismiss it. Then finally, on my list of things over the past month that have led me to think, well, this thing sure ain't slowing down, was and this is actually another good person to follow, in addition to Nathan's stuff, I would say, is Ethan Mollick on Twitter. He doesn't have a podcast or newsletter, I think. But I saw a tweet of his referring to, it was a paper called Self-Play Fine-Tuning Converts Weak Language Models to Strong Language Models. His tweet was, "This is more evidence that AIs are not going to be limited by the amount of human-created content available for them to train on. This is another paper suggesting that AI's training on AI-created data can achieve higher quality results than just using human-created data alone." It's funny. I looked at the paper, and I'd say there's something else that at least seems kind of notable about it, about this paper, which is that they basically take a model and play it against itself. The famous case of that is AlphaGo, right? Where it became the greatest Go player in the known universe by playing against itself and improving as it played. Well, this is that same dynamic where you don't have to feed it any new human-generated text, but it plays this game against itself and gets better and better in a way that I think I dimly understand, but don't need to get into. So one reason that's relevant is because there were people who had been saying, oh God, these things are going to be more and more training on stuff created by AI, because the internet is more populated by that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's bad because that's famously faulty. I mean, whether it's any more faulty than human generated content is a question I won't get into, but that was the claim. Mm-hmm. And so this, I guess, to some extent addresses that concern. Anyway, all of these things suggest to me that we're moving pretty fast. I'll hold off on reiterating why this worries me, which I've said before, mm-hmm. Until I get your take on whether you think I'm reading too much into all this.
Sure. Yeah. So let's talk before I answer that question. Let's talk a little bit more about the Mamba paper and the this spin paper. So the spin paper it was interesting. So that's the paper that where they created the synthetic data. The way that works is they have two networks where they have one network that's trying to create data and another network that's trying to distinguish the computer created data from human examples. Mm-hmm. And then it's kind of a competition where the better it gets at fooling the one model network, the better the other network tries to get
The
better
closer it gets
at
to passing the
distinguishing.
Turing test in a way, so far as the other machine can tell, kind of.
Yeah. So I think that is, I mean, that's a cool result. The key thing to note though is that it does need some human data to compare to, and so like one of the really notable things about large language models right now is they're just really inefficient in the way they use data. You need trillions and trillions of tokens to get close to human performance, and like a human being doesn't see anywhere close to a trillion tokens in their lifetime. And so to some extent, I think that these like synthetic data models are just like helping them get closer to human performance in like the amount of like knowledge they absorb from data, and that it's not obvious to me that that will allow them to kind of go past human performance. Like, it's just like, yeah, if they're only getting 1% of the knowledge from each data point, then you need 100 data points to learn as much as a human would get from one data point. So I think that's like incremental progress, but it doesn't suggest to me necessarily that there's like room for it to kind of soar beyond human abilities. The thing with Mamba, and Mamba's a little bit of this, in the case of Mamba, like the main thing Mamba does is like large language models, because of their architecture, they're really bad at dealing with long context, because the way the transformer works at a fundamental level is there's this attention mechanism where it's comparing words to other words, and it does this in a completely flat way. So if you have 1,000 tokens, it compares every token to every other token. And if you think about how that scales up, the longer the sequence of tokens is, it's more than linear. It's a n squared function, and so it's just not possible to get to millions or tens of millions of tokens. And if you think about how like people in the real world, if you think about your relationship with something you've known for a long time, like you don't remember every word you've ever said to that person. Your brain has some sort of like summary that it sort of go as you go along, you learn the important like kind of conceptual things about the person and relationship you have with them, and shared interests and so forth. And so Mamba is a way of doing that, where rather than remembering every word and doing these comparisons, it has a kind of internal state, internal memory, where it distills the important facts from the text it's seen so far, and carries that context along with it, which then means that it can operate on much longer strings of texts. And so I see this as like an important, it seems to have good performance, and then it's a way of addressing one of the big shortcomings of the transformer. So you could have something that has similar to transformer performance on short sequences, short inputs, but then can deal with much longer inputs, which is really important. I think if you think about the real world impact, like one of the big weaknesses of the transformer is, if you think about an employee, if you imagine you had an employee that every morning they came in, they didn't remember anything that happened the previous day or week or month, right? Like that would not be, for many tasks, that's not useful, because a lot of the value that human workers bring is long context. They remember what happened last week, last month, last year. And so you can imagine a architecture like Mamba being a step towards an AI that has that same property, where rather than having a totally new conversation every time, it remembers previous conversations you had, information about you, et cetera. And so I think that's significant. So so to answer your question about like how fast are things are going, I guess my skepticism about this is less about the AI per se, because like definitely the reason I started my newsletter was that I saw the transformer and it exceeded my expectations. And for the last decade, there's been a series of things, the AlphaGo thing, there's a famous paper called AlexNet about 10 years ago that kind of kicked off deep learning. Like AI has consistently met or exceeded my expectations in terms of how quickly it goes. I just think the bar for like transformational impact on the world as a whole is really high, because the world is just really big and complicated, and historically there's just not that many technologies in history that have had that kind of impact. And so I think as kind of new technologies go, I think it's certainly going to be above average. I think it'll have a big impact on a bunch of industries, but the level of panic people have about like everybody losing their job or everybody being killed, or even like many industries being transformed, I just think it's really hard to have a technology that has that big of an impact. And I think about like the internet is kind of the model I think about here. Like people talk about the internet, how it's changed everything, and it certainly has changed some things. Like certainly the media industry that you and I are both part of, it's had a huge impact. But if you think about people's just like day-to-day lives today versus 50 years ago, Like our houses are basically the same. We drive cars that look pretty much the same as they did 50 years ago. Just
Can I
like,
interject something?
sure, yeah,
Our country is closer than ever in my lifetime to civil war, and a lot of people rightly, I think, attribute some of that to the dynamics of social media. Now, I don't
yes,
think we're close to civil war, let me emphasize, but obviously we have a deep polarization problem, and you're
absolutely,
seeing this play out on the international stage and intersect with and work in kind of unfortunate synergy, I would say, with domestic polarization. You see that with the Gaza thing.
yes,
Um,
yeah. So,
and
so I absolutely
I
agree.
think, I think that's huge. And I think AI in certain ways can be seen as a natural extension of social media, like social media on
Mhm.
steroids, potentially,
Yes,
because, first of all, the default approach, if you're making AI, is to optimize engagement, right?
hmm,
You want people
yep,
to keep using your product. Well, we saw what kind of algorithms that produced on social media and what kind of behavior they encouraged, and how what a warped view of what's actually going on in the world they've given to people in the various tribes who really spend a lot of time on social media, and given them a darker and darker and darker view of the other tribe
yep,
by depicting actually atypical or not super typical behavior on the other side as typical, giving you the idea as typical, and they're all crazy extremists and so on. I won't go on, but I do want to say before I put the ball back in your court, you alluded to the fact that, well, Mamba doesn't necessarily get us to kind of super intelligence, and I would emphasize um, my fears aren't mainly of the kind of Yudkowsky Doomer kind where this superintelligence decides to squash humankind. I'm more worried about a bunch of different mundane effects that add up to massive destabilization and
hmm,
lead me to hope that things will go maybe not as fast as they're going. But
hmm.
that just so
No,
that's
I definitely think one of the biggest impacts is likely to be changes to the media environment that then could lead to political destabilization. So yeah, we completely agree about that. And, it's hard to predict, and it's also a little hard, I think, to attribute. So definitely, I think broadly speaking, changes in media are responsible for a lot of the media the political changes we've seen. But like I think talk radio and cable news have been important to that, and that is
mhm,
in some sense new technology, but it's
sure.
not the internet per se. And I think those things are cumulative. So certainly social media is already starting to destabilize. I think AI will contribute to that. But like maybe that's why it's not super clear to me that like slowing down AI per se is going to make a huge difference because I think it's like adding, at the margin it has an effect. But um, yeah, I just think it's like um, um, there's already enough. Current AI already has enough capability that it'll probably have some politically destabilizing effect, and we already have social media. We already have just kind of more media competition in general. And so yeah, but yeah, I agree with you that that's a big impact. But I think people, yeah, so that's what I mean is like on the scale of like what's going to happen, there's the Yukowski view that's going to kill everybody, and then there's everybody's out of work, and then below that there's maybe the political system will be destabilized, and then it's like maybe somebody will make $1 billion. I'm like those are like orders of magnitude difference, and I'm just sort of in the middle, and I think people jump
Mhm.
all the way to the like nobody has a job or everybody's dead. And I'm somewhere in the middle where it's a big deal for sure. It's just a question of kind of what bar are you setting for that?
Yeah, I mean, the job thing is another concern of mine. I mean, first of all, there's more reason than there has been in the past to think that maybe this time it won't just be a reshuffling of jobs. Obviously, technology's done that time and time again. There are no blacksmiths now, right? They had to find new
Mm-hmm.
work, but the technology kept creating new forms of work. Uh, and I'm agnostic as to whether this time is different just because now we're automating the brain itself. But even if it turns out that, yeah, new jobs are available, you know, it takes time to adapt. It's the same thing with, in the realm of politics and and all of these effects I worry about. If you have enough time to adapt and think about them, society can adapt. But when a lot of things hit you super fast, it's hard to adapt. That's kind of more my concern. And I mean, leave aside for now whether there's any realistic hope of slowing things down. I would say at a minimum, my mantra is look, if there's some reasonable form of regulation that someone proposes, and the main argument against it is it'll stifle innovation, I would say consider the possibility that's a feature, not a bug. That should not be an argument against the technology that shows so many signs of starting to move super fast and be transformative, both for good and for bad. Obviously, a lot of good, it can bring a ton of good stuff. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I would say the experience I've had of the last year is, on the one hand, lots and lots of people are saying what you're saying, which is AI is moving so fast, new things keep coming out, et cetera, et cetera. But then something I've tried to do is just go around and ask people, like, what AI tools are you personally using in your work?
Mm-hmm.
And lots of people use ChatGPT for, I would say, kind of one-off thing. You know, I'm throwing a birthday party and I want to brainstorm, good activities, or I'm traveling to Europe and I want to ask, things like that, where it's like not like something you use every day, but like that's the main thing I've gotten. But beyond with ChatGPT, like people use ChatGPT for kind of one-off things. But then if you think about other tools, programmers use, coding assistants. But that's pretty much it. Like so far, there's really not any other killer app. And there's not, like, I think when people encountered Google or Amazon for the first time, it was like really clear what that was, especially Amazon. Like it's a new like shopping thing. Like nobody was like kind of confused about that, or like once you learned about it, you would start buying books regularly on Amazon. And so far, I've seen very few things like that. Now that might just be it's super early. It's 1991 in the internet instead of 1995. But so far, it's like the technology, quote unquote, is advancing very quickly. But I have not been able to find a lot of impacts on the kind of real world. And it's might just be delayed, but I think it's also like people underestimate. There's the saying, that people overestimate how much they can do in a year and underestimate how much they can do in 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a similar kind of dynamic here, where I don't think 2024 is going to be like crazy, right? In terms of like people losing jobs or stuff like that. But in 10 years, I think there could be big impacts. And I think it's hard I think that's a hard amount of time for people to think about, because it's long enough that like a lot of stuff can happen in the meantime. It's like, but it's not, but we're all good. Hopefully we're all still going to be alive in 10 years. So we do need to think about it, but it's like hard to calibrate like how fast is fast over that kind of time scale.
Yeah. Well, what I think is at a minimum, it's not going to be the case that like 3 years from now, people are going, oh, remember that wave of AI hype? I think there's no way any sensible person is not going to be seeing this 3 years from now as an extremely important development that takes grappling with.
And that's partly because, and I think that's partly because it's happening on so many different modalities, right? So you got the language models, you got the image models, you've got facial recognition, you've got, deep fake like voice systems, and then you've got all sorts of like, businessy things like for targeting ads and financial flows and stuff. So it's just, this is very clearly a very general purpose tool that even if the really ambitious stuff doesn't happen, like facial recognition, for example, is like that is something actually people are using. And I think people are underestimating how big of an impact it will have. So I totally agree. It's significant. It's going to have a big impact over the next 5 or 10 years, but it's not like next year we're all going to.
And on the jobs front, I have had a couple of conversations over the last month that have gotten my attention. One is there's a friend of mine who's dean of a law school. Mm-hmm. And I asked him, I was talking, this wasn't the main subject of the conversation, but I asked him, like, what do you think of this? And he just said, oh, it's over, man. This is going to be an earthquake. He said, these people billing $500 an hour, guess again. I mean, somebody may be billing $500 an hour, but that's going to be because they're doing 10 times as much work as they used to be doing and using AI. And that means there's going to be a lot of lawyers that there's not going to be enough work for. And then the other conversation is somebody, he's in the grant proposal writing business. Not a big part of the industry, but I asked him, like, so have you fooled around with AI? He said, oh, God, it's completely essential. He says, I say, and it isn't just like the writing, it kind of comes up with a plan. And in a certain sense, grant proposal writing is perfect for this, because half of the content of the thing, everyone knows, is just bullshit, whose job is just to fill space on the page, right? And just like, And the people, half the times, the grants are actually wired anyway. You know, you're going to give it to the person or not. Anyway, so I can see why, it doesn't have to be finely crafted as some forms of writing. And again, this is just a very small example, but obviously what this means is he can do more work in an hour, productivity grows. And unless for some reason I don't anticipate, the number of grants awarded explodes, and so there's enough work to, to compensate for this. That's going to mean that some people making a living at this are going to have to find another line of work.
I don't think that's actually right, though. So actually, I think these are both good examples. So with lawyers, like being a lawyer is an adversarial process. So if the plaintiff's lawyer is 10 times more productive and can look at 10 times more documents and think about 10 times more precedents, et cetera, and the defense doesn't change anything, then the plaintiffs are going to win more cases. But like the defense can also do that. And so I think you could have a world where like the lawyers are 10 times more productive, but that just means that people do 10 times as much work to kind of get to a similar outcome. And similarly with grant making, like it's maybe what's required to get a grant is going to be 10 times more complex. I mean, you think about, this is why I think the internet's a good example. Like you think about, oh God, how did anybody like get anything done without email? And the answer was people sent fewer messages and there was like less communication that happened. And when the internet was invented, like communication became more efficient, but as a result, people communicated more. And now we spend 2 hours reading through emails that wouldn't have existed 20 years ago. So you have to think about both the supply and the demand side. Like AI makes it more efficient to do things, but then often the result is like more things happen because, people want the things. And so the demand for the things go up. And it's like, I think it's like hard to make a general statement. Like there are going to be some industries where you supply more stuff and people only want so much stuff. And so then you have fewer workers. But there's going to be other cases where people supply more stuff and people really want the stuff. And so they actually consume a lot more. And like in the early phases of a lot of industries, like actually total employment goes up. You go way back to like the very first case of automation, like with with textiles, like the early decades of the textile industry, employment grew and grew and grew because even though like clothing was getting cheaper, like people wanted a lot more clothing, and so total output increased. I think it's complicated, and I think that absolutely people are going to integrate AI into their workflows, and that will make them more productive at certain things. And in some industries, that will mean some job losses. In other industries, I think it could easily be job gains because the cost of stuff goes down. This is also I did a piece about the translation industry. This is what you see. The translation industry has, for like, natural language from like English to Spanish or whatever, it's kind of bifurcated. There's a high-end market of people doing translations. The machines aren't sophisticated enough for things like legal and medical, where the stakes are very high and there's like technical jargon as they want to make sure it's case. But then there's a low end where basically the job is the machine does a rough translation and then a human looks through it for any errors. And what's happened is like people are translating a lot more stuff than they used to because there's lots and lots of material out there that people would like to translate they couldn't afford to. And so employment has been kind of, I think, roughly kind of breaking even, right? It's like the what you can make per word at the kind of mass market one is going down, but people can do more. And so it kind of ends up being a wash.
I mean, I'm not sure I buy all this. The translation thing is an interesting example because it is definitely a case where you're going to wind up with just tons more translation, just like, tourists in Europe with simultaneous translation going into their ears can just basically talk to people. That's going to be amazing. And who knows, maybe that'll have a good effect on the world. There is this kind of old and seemingly discredited worldview that one big source of international tension is that people speak different languages. I don't really think that's a big part of the problem, but maybe it'll finally get its day in court, since not everyone had time to learn Esperanto, which was the previous approach to getting everyone to be able to understand each other. Speaking of days in court, though, I want to push back on that example of this not ultimately reducing the demand for lawyers, and maybe this is a good segue to the New York Times lawsuit, because I would say, look, I doubt that you could make the New York Times lawsuit stronger, much stronger, right? I doubt they overlooked major arguments that you could make. In fact, it seems to me some of their arguments are already a little strained as it is. And that seems to be your premise, right? That, well, you'll still need as many lawyers. It's just that the briefs, the legal briefs, will be a lot stronger, consider a lot more things. I mean, first of all, a lot of these things can't just get longer. Same with grant proposals. It's not like, and so I don't know. Will they?
Well, so like a concrete example with lawyers, a lot of what lawyers do is document review. If you have a big lawsuit between two companies, you say like, give me every email that all of your executives have sent for the last 10 years. And then you have people that code through them for examples of making whatever point you want. And right now there's like a limit. And like one of the fights is like how much.
But that's surely automatable, right?
Well,
that's classic GPT.
Sure. No, but that's what I'm saying is right now, lawyers can only have time to look at in a typical lawsuit, can only have time. There's a limit to how much they can look at. And so now you can look at 10 or 100 times as much. And the AI does 90% of the work and produces, here's the like 500 most promising emails. And so the lawyer is able to effectively look at 100 times more material with the same amount of time. And so then it has like 7 examples of the executive saying something incriminating instead of just one example.
Yeah, but the person who was combing through the emails is still out of work. This kind of entry level, just out of law school, whatever they call those people.
Right. You know. So the I mean, there's a question of like, is the AI partially automating or wholly automating the process?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, if you have an AI that takes emails as an input and outputs a brief, then yes, the lawyer's out of work. But I think that what you're more likely to see is software tools that comb through the emails and write a draft, like a draft brief that the client then wants a human being to look over. Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a short-term versus long-term question here. Like over the next 5 to 10 years, I'm pretty confident like that's what's going to happen. Like there's not going to be that, partly just for like kind of regulatory reasons, like you need a license to do certain things. Like in the next 5 to 10 years, what I think you're going to have to see is like lawyers get more productive, and therefore the amount of like legal work that happens goes up. Now, yeah, I can in 30 years, you know, are lawyers going to?
This could be a libertarian's nightmare, Tim. I have bad news for you, right? Just tons of more court activity,
right? Lawsuits,
frivolous lawsuits, stymieing the magic of capitalism. This is a problem. You should get worked up about this.
Yeah,
more motion.
Yeah, so I'm not like going to make like a strong prediction that like lawyers are definitely not going to be thrown out of work, but I'm just saying it's like it's complicated, right? Because there are some aspects that are automatable and some that are not. And if you automate the automatable parts, there might be other parts of the job that then become they're more in demand for them because they're complementary to the automated parts. And I think that's what you see in when most of these industries, when I look at them closely. I mean, you see the thing with like self-driving cars, which I've written a fair amount about. There's no more drivers, but you still need people to repair the cars, to clean the cars, to handle customer service calls. And so like in the long run, can all that stuff be automated? I don't know, maybe, but like
customer service calls are a good candidate, very good candidate. And I'll tell you, a lot of them will be easier to understand. I mean, you know, I mean, I don't know. Anyway,
maybe I think this is like a 10 to 20 year thing as opposed to a 3 to 5 year thing. I don't have a strong prediction of what's going to happen in 20 years, but I think people underestimate how long it takes to kind of change industries and business models and
well, I would actually say, I mean, it is still kind of New Year's. I might as well make a prediction. I think by the end of 2024, take an example like, what's going to happen when the people who have gotten wrapped up in social media get wrapped up in an actual bot? Right? Like this is their source of ideological wisdom or personal counseling, and things can go badly wrong. I predict that by the end of 2024, we will have case studies and things having gone badly wrong. And maybe they'll be overblown and unrepresentative, and it's actually only happening to 100 people, and we've read about 70 of them in the newspapers. Who knows? But I think you will see some of this stuff will begin to assume concrete form.
That sounds totally plausible.
Yeah. So maybe we should, now we're not that far from the magic moment when the paywall descends and people who want to listen to the rest of this, which we both encourage them to do, I think, need to become paid subscribers either to the Nonzero newsletter or to the Understanding AI newsletter. But let's what do you want to, before we get there? Well, let me say one quick thing on the anti-acceleration front, and I'll turn this over to you. I should note that one thing that's happened since we last talked, Google had this big rollout that was something of a fizzle. It was the long-awaited Gemini. Is this going to be as good as GPT-4, better? We don't actually know for sure because there's a version of Gemini, I think it's called Ultra, that isn't released yet. But in general, people were not blown away. Part of the problem is that Google's marketing people made the very big mistake of releasing a video that was just flat out misleading about what it could and couldn't do. That didn't help. But anyway, I would say, and I think you've kind of raised this question, like, maybe you haven't. Maybe Nathan Labins has on the aforementioned podcast, or maybe both of you have. But like, is GPT 4.0 maybe a kind of not quite an outer bound, but are we getting there? And of course, he might say it may not matter because if so, it's just an outer bound for the transformer model, and now something else is on the horizon. But
yeah,
there's that possibility. Anyways, if you want to say something about any of that, fine. And also anything you want to quickly say about the New York Times copyright lawsuit, which I think we'll get into in more depth on the other side of the paywall. You wrote about it in your newsletter, as you said.
Sure. Yeah. So no, I agree with everything you said about Gemini. I mean, Google has some of the best researchers in the world. They have massive amounts of compute, and Gemini was supposed to be their kind of GPT-4 killer. And it's like a little better in the version that they haven't released yet because they're still working on it. What they say is they're still doing the kind of safety stuff, and they're supposed to, I guess, like early 2024, they're supposed to release it. But yeah, that provides like not the definitive evidence, but one data point that suggests that the transformer model might be running out of steam. But yeah, absolutely, I think that things like this Mamba model, or maybe something else that people will invent in the next few months, could easily replace it. So I'm not like predicting the end of large language models, but I think it's very possible that the transformer is not at the peak, but like we'll see kind of the flat part of the S curve in the next year or two.
Because the idea had been more scale, more parameters. The models get bigger and more powerful, and the models will just get more amazing. The other view is actually no, you need a qualitative improvement in the technology, and that may turn out to be the truth. Any short takeaway you want to say about the New York Times copyright lawsuit before we explore that in more depth?
No, we can do that. We can do that in over time.
Okay. Well, then why don't we make that transition? I guess we're probably not even halfway through this conversation, but obviously we encourage people to sign up for our newsletters. For starters, even if you don't want to become a paid subscriber, but we certainly, I think you will join me in encouraging people to become paid subscribers to one of our newsletters.
Absolutely, to get the best content, you need to be a paid subscriber,
and to know that you're supporting a worthwhile cause, because one of us is going to turn out to be right. Which reminds me, maybe the way, if people want to be sure they're supporting a good cause, they should actually become paid subscribers to both newsletters, because one of us is going to turn out to be right about AI, right?
That sounds
that
right.
That makes total sense. Okay. With that said, thanks everybody who's listened so far, whether you're going to keep listening or not. And with that, we move into overtime.